It is the year 1348, and somewhere in the English countryside, a rooster has not yet crowed. The sky outside is still the color of ash, caught in that strange gray hour before true morning, when the world has not yet decided whether it belongs to night or day. In a small house made of timber, mud, and straw, a family lies pressed together for warmth. An ox breathes quietly in the same room, its body heat mixing with the smoke of a dying fire. None of them know it yet, but before this year is finished, 1 in every 3 people they have ever known will be dead. This is not the story of kings, or of castles, or of knights riding beneath banners. This is the story of the people history so often forgets to mention: the peasants, the farmers, the laborers who grew the food, built the walls, and carried the dead to their graves. Tonight, we step backward across 7 centuries into the mud and the smoke and the long silences of a world standing on the edge of catastrophe, to understand, in quiet detail, what it truly meant to live and to die. As a peasant during the Black Death, the peasant's day does not begin with sunlight. It begins in darkness, long before the first gray light touches the fields. In the height of summer, the work could start as early as 3 in the morning, hours before the sun cleared the horizon, because the harvest waited for no one, and the animals did not care whether their keeper had slept well or barely at all. Sleep itself was a shared, communal thing. An entire family, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, might live and sleep within a single room, their bodies arranged close together, not for affection alone, but for survival, since warmth in winter could mean the difference between waking and not waking at all. In many households, livestock lived beneath that same roof, separated from the family only by a low wall or a woven fence, their breath and their warmth doubling as heating through the coldest months of the English year. There was no glass in the windows, only small openings covered with shutters, oiled cloth, or nothing at all. There was rarely a proper chimney, only a hole in the thatch, or sometimes not even that, so that the smoke of the hearth fire drifted upward and simply settled across everything: the walls, the roof beams, the lungs of everyone inside. Cleanliness, in a world like this, was not a matter of habit or discipline. It was a luxury that almost no one could afford. Outside the house, the village itself was already beginning to stir in the half-dark. Animals wandered loose through the narrow, unpaved paths that ran between the homes. Chickens, pigs, the occasional goat, leaving their waste wherever they pleased. Human waste, too, was often thrown out into these same paths, left to the elements and to whatever crept through the shadows to feed on it at night. It was, without question, the perfect breeding ground for disease, though no one in the village understood why. They only understood that in certain seasons, sickness came, and in certain seasons, it did not, and there seemed to be no way to predict which would be which. Prayer was the only medicine most families could reliably afford, and prayer, though it offered comfort, offered no protection against what was coming. Every peasant in this world belonged, in some fundamental way, to the land, and more precisely, to whoever owned the land beneath their feet. Some worked a small strip of ground they were permitted to farm for their own family's use, a patch of soil that might yield barley, or oats, or vegetables enough to survive the winter if the weather cooperated and the harvest was kind. Others worked land belonging to a local lord entirely, laboring in his fields in exchange for protection, for shelter, for the simple right to remain living where they had always lived. Almost none of the land itself truly belonged to the people who spent their entire lives working it. This was the feudal system, a rigid ladder of authority and obligation with the king standing at the very top, followed by nobles and wealthy merchants, and at the very bottom of that ladder, bearing the weight of the entire structure on their backs, the peasants themselves. It was a world built on inherited position rather than earned merit, where a person's entire life, the work they did, the food they ate, the freedoms they were or were not allowed, was largely determined before they had taken their first breath. The work of the peasant did not pause for bad weather, and it very rarely paused for illness, because the fields could not be convinced to wait. Plowing had to happen when the ground was ready, not when the body was rested. Animals had to be fed and watered every single day, without exception, because an animal does not understand the concept of a day off. Whatever a family managed to grow across the long agricultural year, a portion of it belonged, by law and by custom, to the Lord who owned the land, taken as rent, taken as tax, taken simply as the price of being permitted to exist there at all. There was no concept of a weekend, no structured holiday beyond the feast days dictated by the church calendar, no vacation in any sense a modern person would recognize. The entire rhythm of the year was dictated by the seasons themselves. Plant in spring, tend through summer, harvest in autumn, endure the long hunger of winter, and then, if all had gone well enough to survive, begin the entire cycle again the following spring. And through all of this, the labor, the hunger, the ever-present threat of a bad harvest, medicine, as we understand it now, offered almost nothing. Doctors, in the rare cases where a peasant could reach one at all, relied on ideas and texts passed down from physicians who had lived and died more than 1,000 years earlier. Ideas about the balance of bodily humors that had little connection to the actual causes of disease. Illness, more often than not, was explained not through any understanding of biology, but through sin, through divine punishment, through the mysterious and unquestionable will of God. The church held as much authority over how a person understood their own body and their own suffering as any physician of the age possibly could. So when the sickness finally came, and it did come relentlessly, beginning in the year 1347, there was almost no one in these villages who could explain what it actually was. They could only watch in mounting horror as it spread from town to town, from village to village, from household to household, seemingly without mercy and without pattern. It began, most historians now believe, far away from England entirely, somewhere in the vast expanse of Central Asia, before moving steadily westward along the network of trade routes that connected the known world, carried unknowingly by merchants, by soldiers, by travelers who had no idea what they were transporting alongside their goods. By the time it reached the shores of Europe in the year 1347, it was no longer a distant rumor whispered about in marketplaces. It was already arriving at the door. The disease that history would eventually name the Black Death was carried, we now understand, by fleas, which fed upon infected rats, and which then, once those rats had died from the same disease, sought out new hosts entirely, including human beings crowded into towns and villages, living in homes with dirt floors, no sanitation, and no understanding of how illness actually traveled from one body to another. For a wealthy noble family, there existed an option that a peasant simply did not have available to them, the option of leaving. Those with money, with land holdings elsewhere, with horses and the means to travel quickly, could flee an infected town or city the very moment sickness began to appear among the population. For the ordinary villager, tied to a single strip of farmland, with no second home, no spare income, and fields that could not simply tend themselves in their owner's absence, there was, quite literally, nowhere else to go. To leave the land was to abandon the only source of food and shelter a family possessed. And so peasants, more often than any other class of medieval society, remained exactly where the disease could find them most easily. The chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, writing about the common people trapped within the crowded cities of this period, described how the poor sickened by the thousands, with almost no one left able or willing to help them, dying in numbers that overwhelmed every institution meant to care for the sick and bury the dead. Those living out in the countryside were, in certain ways, somewhat more isolated from the very first waves of outbreak that struck the crowded cities. But when the plague did eventually reach a rural village, as it inevitably did, there was often no physician within any reasonable distance, no organized help of any kind whatsoever. Villagers of the time described the dying not as people cared for gently in their final hours by loved ones, but as figures essentially discarded by circumstance, found in the fields, found along the roads, found within their own homes at any hour of the day or night, with no one left healthy enough or brave enough to tend to them. Try, for a moment, to imagine that particular kind of stillness settling over a place. A village that had, only weeks earlier, been full of the ordinary noise of daily life. Children calling to one another across the paths between houses, animals being driven to pasture, the steady rhythm of work continuing from dawn until dusk, now falling half silent, day by day, as more and more of its people fell ill and did not recover. Nearly every family in the village found itself missing someone. Every remaining household lived under the same unbearable, unanswerable question: who would be next? By the time the very worst of this first wave had finally passed, historians estimate that the plague had killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of Europe. Not 1/3 of those who happened to fall ill. 1/3 of every single person alive on the continent at the time it began. And yet, even in the midst of devastation on this almost incomprehensible scale, life, in whatever diminished, grief-stricken form, remained possible, continued. Fields still needed tending for those family members who remained standing. Animals still needed to be fed, regardless of who had died the night before. Grief, in a world constructed the way this one was, could not be allowed to bring the work to a complete stop, because stopping the work meant certain starvation through the winter that would inevitably follow, plague or no plague. There is something almost unbearable to consider in that particular truth, that in the very same week a peasant buried a parent, or a spouse, or a child, that same peasant was expected, by necessity if by nothing else, to rise again before dawn the following morning and return, exhausted and grieving, to the same fields as always. Consider, too, the sheer uncertainty that defined every single day of this period for an ordinary family. A person might wake feeling entirely well, share a simple meal with their household, walk out to the fields under a gray morning sky, and by the time evening fell, notice the first faint ache beginning in their own body. A swelling beneath the arm, a fever creeping in without warning, a fatigue that felt different, somehow, from ordinary exhaustion. There was no test, no way of knowing for certain what any particular symptom meant until it had progressed far enough to leave little room for doubt. Neighbors watched one another with a kind of quiet, constant vigilance, searching for the earliest signs in each other's faces, in each other's gait, in the sound of a cough that might mean nothing, or might mean everything. Trust, in some village communities, began to erode under this pressure. Families who had lived beside one another peacefully for generations sometimes found themselves avoiding contact entirely, unwilling to risk a friendly visit that might carry the sickness from one household into another. Doors that had once stood open through the warmer months were closed. Shared wells, shared ovens, shared gathering places that had once been the quiet center of community life became sources of anxiety instead of comfort. In some parts of Europe, when a household had confirmed sickness within its walls, the response of the wider community could be swift and unforgiving. Homes were sometimes marked, so that others in the village would know to keep their distance. Food, when it was brought to the afflicted at all, might be left outside a door rather than carried in by hand. This was not, in most cases, born of cruelty, but of a desperate and entirely understandable fear. A fear rooted in the simple, brutal observation that families who nursed their sick often fell sick themselves, one after another, until an entire household had been lost. Isolating the ill, crude and painful as it was, represented one of the only strategies available to a population with no understanding of germs, no concept of contagion in the modern sense, and no medicine capable of treating the disease once it had taken hold. The role of the church during this period cannot be overstated, and its position, too, was placed under enormous strain. Priests were often among those most exposed to the disease, since their duties required them to sit with the dying, to hear final confessions, to perform last rites for the departing and funeral rites for the dead. Sometimes dozens of times in a single week, in villages hit hardest by the outbreak. Many priests died carrying out these very duties, and in some parishes, so many clergy were lost that there was simply no one remaining to perform the sacred rites the community depended upon for comfort in its darkest hours. This absence was felt acutely. In a world where the church provided not only spiritual guidance, but also much of the social structure and shared meaning that held a community together, the loss of so many priests left a wound that went beyond the purely medical toll of the disease. Some historians have pointed to this period as one that began, slowly and unevenly, to shake the previously unquestioned authority the church held over ordinary life. If prayer and ritual could not stop this particular horror, what, people began quietly to wonder, could? The image of the plague doctor, though it belongs more properly to later outbreaks of plague in subsequent centuries, has become deeply associated in popular memory with this era. The long beaked mask, filled with fragrant herbs meant to filter the supposedly poisonous air believed to carry disease, the dark waxed robes meant to shield the wearer's skin from contact with the sick. During the 14th century outbreak itself, most rural villages had no access to any physician at all, let alone one equipped with even this crude form of protective equipment. Treatment, where it existed, more often consisted of prayer, of certain herbal remedies passed down through generations of folk knowledge, of desperate and largely ineffective measures like bloodletting, believed at the time to restore balance to a body's disrupted humors. None of it addressed the actual cause of the disease. None of it could. Burial itself became one of the greatest logistical and emotional challenges of the entire period. In ordinary times, a death within a medieval village was marked by careful, communal ritual. A proper wake, a funeral procession, burial within consecrated ground close to the parish church, surrounded by family and neighbors who had known the deceased throughout their life. During the worst months of the outbreak, this entire structure of mourning collapsed under the sheer weight of the death toll. In many towns and cities, and eventually in smaller villages as well, mass graves became the only practical solution to a problem of scale that individual burial simply could not accommodate. Bodies were sometimes carried by cart through the streets, collected from households where entire families had perished together, and laid to rest in long communal trenches dug at the edge of town, without individual markers, without the customary rites, without the dignity that every person in this deeply religious society would have expected in death. For survivors, this represented its own particular grief. Not only the loss of a loved one, but the loss of any proper way to mourn them, to visit a grave, to grant them the peaceful rest that their faith had always promised was owed to the departed. It is worth pausing here to consider what the emotional weight of this period might actually have felt like from the inside, for an ordinary person living through it without any of the historical hindsight we now possess. There was no newspaper to explain what was happening in the wider world, no way to know with any certainty whether the plague would eventually end, or whether this was simply how the world now was, permanently. Rumors traveled from village to village alongside the disease itself. Rumors that the end of the world had finally arrived. Rumors that the sickness was a punishment sent by God for the collective sins of mankind. Rumors, tragically and unjustly, that blamed particular minority communities for poisoning wells and causing the outbreak. Rumors that led in some regions to horrific violence against Jewish communities who bore absolutely no responsibility for the disease but became scapegoats for a terrified and grieving population searching desperately for someone, anyone, to blame. Historians today are careful to document this dark chapter honestly, because understanding the full human response to catastrophe, including its darkest and most shameful instincts, is essential to understanding this period completely and truthfully. And yet, within all of this darkness, ordinary peasant families continued to find small, quiet ways to endure. Children who survived still needed to be fed and cared for, and parents who had lost some of their own children clung all the more fiercely to those who remained. Neighbors who had not turned away from one another shared what little food or resources they had left. Songs, prayers, and stories. The same oral traditions that had carried this culture through famine and war for generations continued to be passed down, offering brief moments of comfort and connection, even in the depths of collective grief. The human capacity for resilience, for finding small pockets of ordinary life even inside extraordinary catastrophe, appears again and again in the historical record of this period, a quiet thread of endurance running beneath the overwhelming statistics of mortality. As the initial wave of the plague finally began to recede, though it would return in smaller, subsequent outbreaks across the following decades, the survivors of this catastrophe found themselves living in a world that had been permanently and irreversibly altered. And here the story takes a turn that few, in the depths of 1348, could possibly have predicted. The sheer scale of the death toll had created something that had never existed in quite the same way before across medieval Europe, a genuine, widespread labor shortage. With so many workers dead, the peasants who had survived suddenly found themselves holding something they had almost never possessed before in their dealings with the nobility: leverage. Lords who had once dictated every single term of a peasant's working life, the hours, the obligations, the rents, the restrictions on movement from one estate to another, now found themselves desperate enough for labor to till their fields and tend their livestock that they were forced, however reluctantly, to offer higher wages than had ever been paid before, better working conditions than had previously been considered, and in some documented cases, genuinely greater personal freedom than serfs had known in generations. Some surviving peasants moved into entirely new social and economic positions that would have seemed almost unthinkable to their own parents only a decade earlier. The rigid, seemingly permanent structure of feudal society, which had appeared as fixed and unchangeable as the seasons themselves, had been cracked open by catastrophe, and through that crack, however slowly, change began to seep in. This shift did not happen overnight, and it did not happen without resistance from those in power, who had every incentive to preserve the old arrangement that had served their interests for centuries. Some nobles and even the crown itself attempted, through legislation, to freeze wages at their pre-plague levels, to prevent peasants from leaving one lord's land in search of better terms elsewhere, to restore, by force of law, the very system that the plague had begun to erode. But the underlying economic reality, a drastically smaller workforce facing the same amount of land in need of tending, proved difficult to legislate away entirely. Over the decades that followed, tension between what the law demanded and what economic necessity actually required continued to build, generation after generation, like pressure gathering slowly beneath the surface of the ground. That pressure eventually broke into open rebellion in England in the year 1381, in what history now remembers as the Peasants' Revolt, or the Great Rising. The descendants of plague survivors, men and women who had grown up hearing stories of the catastrophe that had reshaped their grandparents' world, and who had lived their entire lives within the new economic reality that catastrophe had created, rose up against attempts to roll back the freedoms and improved conditions that had gradually taken hold since the plague. They marched on London itself, a city that had for centuries represented the unreachable center of royal and noble power, a place no ordinary peasant would ever have imagined confronting directly. They destroyed legal records and tax documents that had long been used as tools of their continued subjugation. They opened prisons. They confronted, however briefly and however incompletely, the very foundations of a social order that had held their ancestors at the very bottom of society since long before any of them had been born. The rebellion itself was ultimately suppressed, its immediate leaders executed, its most dramatic gains rolled back in the short term by a frightened and furious nobility determined to reassert control. But historians looking at the longer arc of the following decades have observed something remarkable. Over the 50 years that followed the Great Rising, life for peasants across England did, in fact, continue to improve, gradually and unevenly, but unmistakably. Wages continued to rise. Personal freedoms continued to expand. The rigid feudal structure that had defined English society for centuries continued its slow, irreversible transformation into something new. Not overnight, not through the dramatic success of a single uprising, but through the accumulated weight of an economic and social shift that had first been set into motion by unimaginable tragedy more than a generation earlier. There is a particular, quiet irony sitting at the very heart of this history, one worth pausing on before we return to the simple, human scale of a single peasant family closing their eyes at the end of an ordinary day. The very same catastrophe that killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of an entire continent's population, the very same disease that emptied villages, filled mass graves, and left almost no family in Europe untouched by grief, also became, however unintentionally and at however terrible a cost, one of the forces that eventually helped dismantle a rigid social order that had held ordinary people in bondage to the land for centuries. Nothing about this makes the suffering endured by that generation any less real, any less devastating, any less worthy of being remembered honestly and completely. But history is rarely simple, and rarely offers the clean, comfortable narratives we might wish it did. Sometimes the worst catastrophe a society has ever endured becomes, decades later and only in hindsight, one of the hinges upon which an entirely new future eventually turns. Before the sickness arrived, before the world tilted so violently on its axis, there had been ordinary days worth remembering, and it is worth spending some time in one of them, if only to understand more fully what was actually lost. Picture a market day in the years just before the plague reached this particular village, a day that would have felt, to the people living through it, like nothing more than an unremarkable Tuesday. The village green, usually quiet, filled slowly from mid-morning onward with carts and stalls and the noise of dozens of small transactions taking place at once. A woman selling eggs from a woven basket balanced against her hip. A man with a cart of turnips and onions, haggling cheerfully with a neighbor over the price of a sack of grain. Children weaving between the legs of adults and animals alike, chasing one another with the particular reckless energy that children have always had in every century, regardless of the hardships surrounding them. The blacksmith's hammer rang out steadily somewhere near the edge of the green, a rhythm so constant that most people had long since stopped consciously hearing it at all. This was a world built almost entirely around barter and small exchange, since coin, though it existed, was scarce among the peasantry. A family might trade a portion of their grain harvest for a length of woven cloth, or exchange labor on a neighbor's land during a busy season in return for the promise of help when their own harvest came due. Reciprocity of this kind was not simply a pleasant custom. It was, in a very real sense, a survival mechanism, since no single family, however hardworking, could realistically produce everything it needed entirely on its own. The village functioned, in this sense, less like a collection of separate households, and more like a single, interdependent organism, each part relying quietly on all the others to keep functioning through the harder months of the year. Marriage in this world was rarely, if ever, a matter of individual romantic choice in the way later centuries would come to understand it. Matches were arranged, often with a careful eye toward practical considerations. The joining of two families' landholdings, the strengthening of an alliance between neighboring households, the simple economic necessity of having enough hands available to work a growing farm. This did not mean that affection and genuine partnership were absent from these marriages. Historical records, letters, and the testimony of those who lived through this period suggest that many peasant couples did, over years of shared hardship and shared labor, develop real bonds of loyalty and care. But the foundation of the arrangement was almost always practical first, romantic second, if romantic elements entered into it at all. Childhood, too, looked profoundly different from anything a modern audience would recognize as familiar. Children were expected to begin contributing meaningful labor to the household from a remarkably young age, sometimes as early as 5 or 6 years old, tending small animals, gathering firewood, helping with the lightest of the agricultural tasks that the adults of the household could not manage alone. This was not, in the context of the time, considered cruel or unusual. It was simply how survival worked in a world with no social safety net beyond the immediate family and the wider village community. Infant and child mortality, even in ordinary years entirely free of plague, remained tragically high by any modern standard, and it was not uncommon for a family to have buried at least one child before that child had reached their 5th birthday. Grief, in this world, existed alongside daily life in a way that later, more medically advanced centuries would find difficult to fully comprehend. Not because people of this era felt loss any less deeply than we do now, but because loss of this particular kind was, tragically, so much more common in experience. It is against this backdrop of ordinary, resilient, deeply interconnected village life that the plague's arrival must be understood, because the disease did not simply kill individuals. It tore through the very fabric of interdependence that had allowed this way of life to function at all. When a third to a half of a village's population died within the span of a single terrible season, it was not only grief that remained in the aftermath. It was also a practical, immediate crisis of survival for everyone left behind. Who would now tend the fields that had belonged to the family who had all perished together in a single week? Who would care for the small children left suddenly without any surviving parent? Who would perform the specific trade? The blacksmith's work, the miller's work, the work of the single midwife serving an entire cluster of villages. When the one person who had always performed it was gone, and no one remained who had been fully trained to take their place. Let us turn now, briefly, to consider how life during this same period looked from within the walls of a wealthier household, not to diminish the suffering of the peasantry in any way, but to understand more fully the full shape of a society under this particular kind of strain. A local lord, living in a manor house built of stone rather than mud and timber, possessed resources that placed an enormous distance between his household's experience of the plague and that of the peasants working his land. His home had proper hearths with functioning chimneys, drawing smoke cleanly up and away rather than allowing it to settle over the household. His family ate meat with far greater regularity than most peasant households could ever manage, and their diet, on the whole, was considerably more varied and more reliably abundant. When the sickness began appearing in the surrounding villages, a lord with sufficient wealth and additional properties elsewhere often had the option, unavailable to virtually any of his tenants, of relocating his entire household to a more distant estate, waiting out the worst of the outbreak in relative safety before eventually returning once the danger had, apparently, passed. This is not to say that wealth offered complete protection. The plague, in its earliest and most virulent waves, killed nobles and clergy alongside peasants, showing little true respect for social rank in the immediate biological sense. Kings, bishops, and wealthy merchants died from the same disease as the poorest laborer working their fields, and the historical record contains numerous accounts of entire noble families wiped out just as thoroughly as any peasant household. But wealth did offer meaningfully greater odds of survival, through the ability to flee crowded and infected areas, through better nutrition that may have offered some general resilience against illness, and through access to whatever limited medical care existed at the time, crude and largely ineffective as it often proved to be. This disparity, the ability of the wealthy to place distance, quite literally, between themselves and the epidemic, while the poor had no such option, is a pattern that historians studying later pandemics across subsequent centuries would recognize as tragically familiar, appearing again and again throughout the long history of infectious disease. Let us now follow, in closer and more particular detail, the experience of a single fictional but historically representative family, in order to understand the human scale of this catastrophe more intimately than statistics alone can ever fully convey. Picture a peasant family in a small village, not far from a market town, a household consisting of a husband and wife in their middle years, 3 surviving children ranging from a toddler to a boy of perhaps 12 years old who had already begun working alongside his father in the fields, and an elderly grandmother who had outlived her own husband by more than a decade and who helped, despite her failing strength, with the endless work of maintaining the household. This family's story is not drawn from any single historical document, but it is constructed carefully from the patterns and details that appear again and again across the surviving records, letters, and chronicles of this terrible period, in order to give a fuller human shape to what the statistics alone can only gesture toward. The sickness, when it finally reached this particular village, arrived first through a traveling merchant who had passed through several weeks earlier, entirely unaware that he carried anything more dangerous than his usual cargo of cloth and small goods. Within days of his passing through, the miller's family, who had purchased cloth from him directly, began falling ill one after another, and within a week, the pattern that had already devastated countless other villages across the region began repeating itself here as well. Fever came first, often sudden and severe, followed by a deep and exhausting fatigue that left even the strongest laborers unable to rise from their beds. Then came the swellings, hard, painful lumps appearing beneath the arms, around the neck, in the groin, growing larger and more agonizing as the days passed, a symptom so specific and so consistently terrifying that it gave the disease one of its earliest names among the ordinary people forced to witness it. For many who developed these particular symptoms, death followed within days, sometimes within hours of the first serious signs appearing. In our fictional family's household, it was the grandmother who fell ill first, and this, tragically, followed a pattern common across countless real households of the period. The elderly, whose bodies were often already weakened by decades of hard physical labor and inconsistent nutrition, frequently proved among the most vulnerable to the disease once it took hold. The family did what every family in their position attempted to do. They kept her as comfortable as circumstances allowed, brought her water and whatever thin broth could be prepared, and prayed, with an intensity that only genuine desperation can produce, that this particular illness would somehow pass without claiming her. It did not. Within 4 days of the first fever, she was gone, and the family faced immediately the same grim, practical question that so many households across Europe were facing simultaneously. How, precisely, does one bury the dead when the parish priest is already overwhelmed with dozens of other households facing the exact same crisis, when the customary rites and rituals that had always accompanied death in this community can no longer be performed with anything resembling their usual care and dignity? The husband and eldest son, the 12-year-old boy who had already spent years working beside his father in the fields, dug the grave themselves in the section of consecrated ground nearest the parish church, though there was no priest immediately available to bless it properly, and no time for the customary wake that would, in ordinary years, have brought neighbors together to share memories and grief in community. She was buried quickly, quietly, with only her immediate family present, a burial that would have seemed almost shamefully rushed and incomplete by the standards of only a year or two earlier, but which had, by necessity, become the new and terrible normal across an entire continent. Grief in this household, as in so many others, did not have the luxury of unfolding slowly. Within 2 weeks of the grandmother's death, the youngest child, the toddler, began showing the same terrible early symptoms. The mother, understanding by now with terrible clarity exactly what these symptoms meant, did everything within her limited power to comfort the child through what followed, holding him through fevered nights, offering what little relief she could, watching helplessly as the disease that had already claimed the grandmother of the household began its work on its youngest and most vulnerable member. The child did not survive the illness. He was buried, like his great-grandmother before him, quickly and without the full ceremony that his family would, in any other circumstances, have wanted desperately to provide him. It would be easy, telling this story from a distance of 700 years, to reduce these deaths to simple statistics, to let them blur into the larger, almost incomprehensible number of a third to a half of an entire continent's population. But for the mother standing over her son's small grave, for the father who had already buried his own mother only weeks earlier, for the older children who now understood, with a clarity no child should ever have to possess, exactly how quickly and completely their family's world could be altered, these were not statistics. They were the entire, devastating shape of their lives during this particular season, a grief so total and so immediate that it left almost no space for anything else. And yet, as we have already discussed, even grief of this magnitude could not fully halt the practical demands of survival. The father and his remaining son, the 12-year-old boy now bearing responsibilities that would, in ordinary times, have belonged to an adult, continued working the family's land through their mourning, because the alternative to working was almost certain starvation for whatever remained of the family come winter. The mother, caring for her one surviving young daughter, continued the endless daily labor of maintaining a household, preparing what food could be prepared, mending clothing, tending whatever small livestock the family still possessed. Because this labor, too, could not simply stop, regardless of how unbearable the circumstances had become. This family, in our reconstructed account, did eventually survive the worst of the outbreak, though permanently altered by what they had endured. And it is here that the darker irony we touched on earlier begins to take on its full, uncomfortable weight. In the years that followed, as the labor shortage created by the plague began reshaping the economic landscape of the English countryside, this same survival